I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until.
Hello and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. What was the biggest mistake everyone made, and what is the solution to what really happened in this case? Well, there are a number of ways to examine the Madeleine McCann case. Bear in mind, in any officially unsolved case, we need to be conscious that there is room for improvement. So we want to be critical of the way the case has been thought about in the past in general, because after all, if the cognitive approach had been more effective in some way, well, we wouldn't be sitting here 16 years later wondering exactly what happened. Now, we don't only want to challenge the way others have thought about this case, we also want to challenge ourselves. How have we been thinking about it? So what do you say? Challenge accepted. Before we get to this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I was in Praia da Luz in 2019, and I'll be applying much of my insights, even the photos I took when I was there, in the analysis in this video. If you appreciate what I've done in this video, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So where do we start? Well, I want to quickly reframe the way we've been thinking about this case. And then what we want to do is then think about a different way, a different framework in which to approach this case. And also offer a few suggestions that may make a lot more sense. And so in order to do this, what you've got to do is open your mind. If you've had one theory, one way of thinking about this case for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, now is the time to open the window to perhaps other possibilities. Now, the most popular way investigators, the media, and the rest of us have thought about this case is visually, via the visual sense. Have you seen Madeleine? What does she look like? Where should we look for her? If you've been paying attention, that strategy hasn't only been a failure, it's led the investigation down all sorts of rabbit holes, dead ends, and garden paths. The visual strategy doesn't work. And if you think about it, Madeleine disappeared at night. So whatever her appearance, very little matters in the visual sense when it's under the cover of darkness. Does that make sense? Does it make sense that focusing on the visual perspective, especially focusing solely on it, is a mistake? In any event, the opposite question isn't where or when did anyone see Madeleine, but where or when did Madeleine disappear from sight? When did we stop seeing Madeleine? In effect, what was her time of death? Unlike many, I don't believe Madeleine died while her parents were out at dinner. I believe it happened earlier than that, and there is an upstairs eyewitness, not Mrs. Fenn, someone else that possibly corroborates this, and we can deal with that in a subsequent analysis. In terms of this analysis, bear in mind that it took investigators more than 3 months to change their approach. And how did they change it? Well, they went from a sight-focused approach, line of sight, can you see her, looking for her on the ground, to smell. And when they did that, when they brought the dogs in, they had a breakthrough. Instantly. Suddenly the case seemed to gain traction and moved forward with lightning speed. Within a few weeks, the authorities wanted to bring charges against the McCanns. And that was all thanks to the dogs. That was thanks to approaching this case from the perspective of smell, basically just a different perspective. And as a result of that, an alternative narrative was formed where Madeleine, although she couldn't be seen, nevertheless seemed to be moving via inference from A to B to C to D. And now it's time we progress to another approach, an approach that is better than smell. Well, what on earth would that be? What do you think it is? What happens when you turn the lights off? And that is exactly where we are in this case, in terms of, that's why I called two of my books Deep into Darkness and Deeper into Darkness. What happens when you go to Praia de Luge, you go to the Ocean Club, and you wait for it to become dark as it was on the night Madeleine disappeared? Well, sunset in Praia de Luge, as I experienced it, I was right there on May 2nd, on May 3rd, on May 4th at the Ocean Club in 2019. And so I experienced it myself, the darkening after the sunsets. The sunsets close to 8:30 p.m. in early May in Praia de Luge in the Algarve. And it is pitch dark about an hour later at around about 11 minutes past 9, but certainly after 9:30, it's not going to get any darker than it already is. So as I say, in May 2019, I visited Praia de Luge after having written 4 books on the case. And you'd think that there wouldn't be too much to learn after writing 4 books. Well, would you like to know what the number one insight I learned while I was there? Let me explain how it happened. It happened in the same road where everything seemed to happen. The same road where Jerry and Jez were apparently talking. The road where Jane Tanner said she was standing when she saw someone. I visited the same spot from many perspectives and on different days. I'd approach on foot in the day on the lower end. I'd approach by car in the day, also from the lower end. I'd walk from the bottom up. I'd drive from the bottom up. I'd walk from the road at the top down. I'd drive from the road at the top down. I would go to the Baptista supermarket, which is at the bottom, and I'd go from there up the road to the apartment, which is the route all the Ocean Club folks would need to make because it was a self-catering spot. And I was also in a self-catering place, so that was where I was going myself to stock up to the Baptista supermarket. And that also gave me some insights in and of themselves. You know, the receipts that I kept, what were the things that I bought there, how much alcohol did I buy, etc. And so I would also go from the apartment 5A down to the Baptista supermarket. Now, it didn't take long to realize if you wanted to take Madeleine out of the apartment without being seen, you wouldn't go near this road because it's such a busy road, because it's leading to a supermarket. So that is the lead up to the insight. It's not the insight itself. The insight came when on the way back from Cape St. Vincent, I was being a bit of a tourist. I went to this beautiful scenic spot in the far west of southwestern Europe. And on May 2nd, I decided to drive by the Ocean Club on the way back to my hotel. And so I parked somewhere with a good view of the apartment. And I just observed. And the road I parked in, as I say, was the same road where all the action took place in the McCann's version of events, Rua Francisco Gentil Martins, named after a well-known Portuguese doctor. And so I parked the car and I just sat there and I observed. And I noticed, for example, exactly when the sun set beneath that wedding cake honeycomb that was sort of marching over the hillside. And I can tell you exactly when that was. It was, I think, something like 8:28 p.m. And you could feel at that time that it was getting noticeably colder. As soon as the sun sank beneath the horizon, it got a lot colder and the wind picked up. And that you could feel was a good time to get indoors yourself. If you had kids, get them indoors, start washing up, start preparing for dinner or bed, etc. Start dressing warmly. Now, the critical insight was one I really didn't expect. While I was sitting outside the apartment, making notes in this growing gloom, and these were notes based on what I was seeing, something entirely unexpected happened. Someone would close their shutter. And that's a recording of a shutter being opened that I borrowed from Pat Brown. I'll put a link to that video. It's about 14 seconds in the description, but it's so important. Someone would close their shutter, and in the cavernous cauldron of apartments, it was a sound that for a moment sounded like a train pulling into a railway station. You'd hear one set of shutters closing, and then a couple of minutes later, another, and then another. Rattle, 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 and you could hear it from far away. These were apartments that were further, I guess, than the distance from the tapas bar, and you could clearly hear them rattling all the way down. So it wasn't barely audible, it was loud, even from a distance. And it was this sound emphasized because of the amphitheater setting, because of these armadas of wedding cake apartment blocks marching up the hillside. And so it amplified the sound. It kind of creates a canyon, causing the sound in certain places also to echo. But that is the key insight, sound. Thinking about this case through the perspective of sound, through the lens of sound. And I'd noticed the same thing in my own apartment in Portugal, how others waking up and opening their shutters woke me up, and vice versa. Think about it. If you wanted to enter apartment 5A, or leave for that matter, you'd want to do so silently and invisibly. To do that, you wouldn't use the window, especially not at night after those shutters are down. This is an interesting area where the McCanns seem to change their statement, originally saying the intruder came in through the window, by breaking and entering, and then leaving the same way, but then amending that version to say that the intruder entered through the sliding door, that is to say silently, and then left through the window, but without breaking anything and evidently without making a sound either.
There was no evidence of a break-in, but I'm not going to go into the detail. I can tell you off camera, but I'm not going to go into the detail on camera. But everything I've said, everything that's I'm not going to get into the so we'll stop. But essential to say that Kate and Jerry are firmly of the view that somebody got into the apartment and took Madeleine out of the window as their means of escape. And to do that, they did not necessarily have to tamper with anything. They got out of the window fairly easily.
Now, that is the spokesman, Clarence Mitchell, trying to do a little bit of damage control, excuse the pun, where previously they'd been asking him, well, how could there be a break-in without any damage? And he was saying, well, maybe they broke in without breaking anything. Opening a window at night, especially at 9:45 p.m., would be an insane thing to do for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, it would wake the babies, right? There were 2 other children sleeping in the same room. Secondly, it would be like deliberately setting off an alarm on your own crime, because everyone would be able to hear it. Thirdly, Madeleine's room, that window overlooks not just a parking lot, but you have a huge block of flats. I think it's 3 stories high with around about 9 apartments in it that overlooks the parking lot and that window. Now, the amazing thing is trying to find photos that capture this perspective of the apartments behind the Ocean Club and what you can see from those apartments. And I must tell you, I probably spent hours trying to find these photos. I obviously stood there myself and I could appreciate that. But it's another thing to have photos, especially taken by other people, that capture that perspective. You can see it from this perspective. And I think you can appreciate that in our obsession with apartment 5A, in being so visually conscious, we've seen the same images probably how many times without really noticing the apartments rising directly behind it and without thinking about the whole case and the whole situation, the whole configuration through the lens, through the prism of sound. And again, they have a perfect view of apartment 5A's window, but that's not the point. They're also perfectly positioned to hear that shutter open, just as I was perfectly positioned in the road that night to hear shutters closing in that entire complex. So to reiterate, there's a honeycomb of at least 9 apartments that are in a perfect position, clustered right around opposite apartment 5A in a perfect position, not so much to see that window, but to hear it. And if anyone is on the balcony right then of that apartment complex opposite, well, the abductor is toast. So there is no way he's going to purposefully open a deafening, rattling window shutter at or close to 10 o'clock at night when it's completely quiet. Not only does it not make sense, there's no evidence it was opened by anyone other than Kate McCann in terms of the fingerprints on those shutters. Now, if we look at Kate McCann's version of events regarding the shutter, in her own book, she writes, "On Madeleine's bed, the top right-hand corners of the covers were still turned over, forming a triangle. Cuddle Cat and her pink princess blanket were lying where they'd been when we'd kissed her goodnight." Now, I must say, as far as I'm concerned, that bed doesn't really look slept in. Anyway, she says, "I dashed over to the second bed on the other side of the travel cots where the twins slept on, oblivious, and looked out through the window. I've no idea what I expected to see there." So she says she looks through the window, but then doesn't do anything. Apparently doesn't touch it. Not sure what she really does there. The interesting thing about what she's saying is that she's putting herself on the one side of the room, who then goes to the other side of the room, whereas Sylvia Batista experienced those travel cots as side by side, and she couldn't actually even imagine how the abductor had gotten to the window with the cots in that position. So it's interesting also what Kate says in this respect. Kate also goes on to say, "In the children's room, Jerry lowered the shutter at the open window." In other words, after Madeleine was taken, Jerry went into Madeleine's room, lowered the shutter at the open window, and then rushed outside. And there he made, according to her, a sickening discovery that the shutter could be raised from this side too, not just from the inside as we thought. And the profiler Pat Brown posted a video of some guy actually raising this shutter, trying to raise it from the outside. And you can see that he does so with some difficulty. You can see him demonstrating it, and you can hear also the noise that it makes. Anyway, I'll put a link to that in the description. In the previous analysis, we went through Sylvia Batista's testimony. According to what she knew, the shutters were down, and despite Jerry saying he closed them, I think it's clear that the window is a red herring, just as it is in the JonBenet Ramsey case. The craziest part is, in the McCann case, the story is that they broke in through the window, the original story, from the outside, forgot to damage anything, forgot to leave any fingerprints, and Jerry then considerately closed the window and shutters, thereby bringing the crime scene back to its original pristine condition and erasing the only clue the abductor left behind. Well, at least in the Ramsey case, something was actually broken. But we can take the crucial insight of sound even further. It's not only the sound of the shutters that are missing. And I can sit here today, 5 years later, and I can tell you I distinctively heard at least 2 sets of shutters closing late that day, right around sunset or just after, on May 2nd, one coming from the apartment block in question. It's also the fact that Madeleine herself never cried out. That's also a sound-related aspect to this. Also the fact that both of her siblings slept silently through the racket as well. In other words, there's a lot of noise going on, and why does this not wake up these very small children? It doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't make sense if a stranger took Madeleine that she didn't cry out. And that's what made the Tanner sighting so ridiculous. Someone carrying a child in his arms, supposedly a stranger with someone else's child, and the child is sleeping soundly in his arms, just doesn't make sense. And it does make sense now what was going on there. We know it was Julian Totman carrying his own daughter, and that is why she was sleeping soundly in his arms. But any other scenario, that wouldn't make sense. Did you know that as early as episode 1 and as late as episode 8, that's the final episode in the Netflix docuseries, The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann, they are still talking exhaustively about the Tanner sighting, going through the sketches with the sketch artist, even interviewing the sketch artist. This is the damage caused by seeing the case exclusively through the lens of sight, being preoccupied with pictures. And let's face it, seeing is believing, but sometimes what you are shown simply isn't true. Another important clue about what is going on not only with Madeleine, but with one of her siblings, and the way the McCanns were dealing with it, also has to do with sound. Pamela Fenn, the upstairs neighbor, said that she heard Madeleine and another child crying more and more loudly for over an hour on May 1st. Let's go to that section of the statement. Mrs. Fenn also refers to the day of the 1st of May 2007, when she was at home alone at approximately 22:30, 10:30 at night. And that's when she heard a child cry, and that due to the tone of the crying, it seemed to be a young child and not a baby of 2 years of age or younger. In other words, Pamela Fenn was imagining a young child and not Madeleine's siblings. She said, apart from the crying that continued for approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes, and which got louder and more expressive, the child shouted, "Daddy, Daddy." The witness had no doubt that the noise came from the floor below. Now, Pamela Fenn's apartment was directly above apartment 5A. Then at about 23:45, that's 11:45 p.m. or 1:45 midnight, which was an hour and 15 minutes after the crying began, she heard the parents arrive. She did not see them, but she heard the patio doors open. She was quite worried as the crying had gone on for more than an hour and had gradually got worse. So this entire witness testimony is based on someone hearing a child crying. Why did this child not cry on May 3rd? Why did none of the other children cry on May 3rd? Because another thing to note, when the windows open at that time of the year in Portugal, you're going to get quite cold. The air outside is cold. And so if the windows open, you're not going to be able to sleep. Now, even the McCanns acknowledged that Madeleine apparently asked, "Where were you?" Something like, "Where were you when we were crying?"
Was Madeleine upset the night before about being left alone? Had she had a moment and got out of bed and started crying and started looking for you?
I mean, I don't want to dwell on it too much. I mean, I don't know if you saw the documentary last night, so I mean, I have talked about it. Madeleine made a comment in passing that, "Where were you when I cried?" Not just to Mummy, by the way, just generally. It just seemed a bit odd. I mean, it was a very kind of passing remark, and we just thought she doesn't usually wake up, and she woke up, that means that, she must have fallen back asleep very quickly. And then she moved on. She moved on.
Anybody with young children will understand that children cry, they wake up at night. During that week, there was one night, and we can't give too much detail because it's part of the investigation file, but there was one night where Madeleine had come through and one of the other twins was crying. So, and when she did mention it to us and we asked her about it, and she just dropped, she was completely fine. And we thought, was it when they were bathing, getting them, first putting them down in that period when they're really tired? Of course, with hindsight,
Now, what's interesting is in the McCann's book, there seem to be two incidents that happen, I think, on the 1st and the 2nd. One involves one of Madeleine's siblings and the other one involves the other sibling, I think. And apparently none of them involve Madeleine herself. And so it's interesting that Pamela Fenn's statement isn't about a little child crying. To her ears, it was an older child crying. In any event, Pamela Fenn's statement seems to be confirmation of a sort that the musical chairs checking system the McCanns and the Tupper 7 claimed they used on May 3rd may not have been in use a day or two earlier. Incidentally, sound is also a crucial and key strategy for figuring out the JonBenet Ramsey case, because JonBenet did actually scream. That scream was also cut off. The person who heard that scream also thought it was a young child, a girl screaming. And what's more, we can be reasonably sure when and even where that happened as well. In any event, I'm not going to take this analysis any further. I see we had about 25 minutes. But if you'd like me to share more of the insights that I found while in Praia da Luz, that May in 2019, please let me know in the comments. Would you like to know about the other insights I picked up on the ground in Praia da Luz? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.